The Life Coaching Toolbox Podcast is brought to you by Joeel and Natalie Rivera of Transformation Academy. In this episode, Joeel talks about identifying relationship warning signs and triggers. This episode is one of 13 episodes in a series that walks you through the complete Enlightened Relationships virtual workshop.
There's a lot of patterns of drama that need to be replaced because we tend to look for ways to meet certain needs in our relationship. And it's important to look at the warning signs, which I'm going to go over, but I'm going to give you a little bit more detail from a psychological perspective and also from a biological perspective of the addictive tendency of drama in relationships. You see, when you go through that cycle that Natalie was discussing, what tends to happen is that there's a rush of adrenaline. In fact, research has shown that drama in relationship is more addicting than heroin and cocaine. And why is it so addicting? Because we go through this cycle and we release adrenaline, and adrenaline is very addictive in itself. So when we have it going through our body, we need to find the different ways to meet that need. So we get that adrenaline. Once that adrenaline drops, we make up. And then we go through that cycle of releasing a bunch of endorphins in our system and dopamine in our system during that makeup. So then our body associates the drama with pleasure, the pain with pleasure. So it's important for us to be able to look at those situations and see, how can I replace them? How can I meet those needs in a more functional way that's going to better help the relationship grow? It's going to better meet our needs, and it's going to help us thrive and be able to have functional communication where we actually understand each other at a very deep level. So the way you do that is to understand your warning signs. Each of us have warning signs, whether it's, our body language. And the reason I put body language first, and obviously there's a section in the workbook that you can kind of reflect on these too. And this might take a little bit longer because as you live your daily life, whether it's with your coworkers, your intimate relationship, your parents, your siblings, you'll be able to look at that and see how some of these changes happen, because some of those changes happen sometimes before our conscious mind realizes what's happening. So if we're able to see it in our partner, if we're able to see it in ourselves, we can make those changes and shift it before it actually takes over and the beast comes out. So body language. 80% of communication is body language. So by the way you're standing, if you're crossing your hands, if you're putting your hands on your hips, whatever it is that you start doing is very important. It's just like when you're feeling a little depressed, you tend to slouch down. When you're feeling power, you tend to put your shoulders back. And even by doing that, you're telling your brain to shift its emotional state, to send more chemicals of adrenaline, of endorphins, chemicals that create happiness. For example, something called facial feedback. When you smile, your brain actually produces chemicals that make you feel happy, because your brain says, well, if they're smiling, that means they must be happy. So let's help them out by producing some chemicals that'll make them happy. So what is your body language? What does it do? Do you get defensive? Again, do you cross your arm? You get in a certain pose? Does your body shut down? How does your partner react to? What about your voice? Obviously, for some people, it tends to escalate where you hear arguing and screaming. For other people, their voice starts diminishing. They start becoming quieter and quieter because they start to introvert. Because in their upbringing, conflict makes them go inside, and hide. So, which is, either way, is both negative. Either way, it's just as bad, because if you're shutting your partner out, if you're screaming at your partner, both of you are rejecting the relationship and communication at that point. So what about the language? Do you tend to use harsh language? And actually, I'm going to jump to number from 2 to 7 real quick, because it's part of the language. What if you're using certain languages when you start seeing those warning signs? Is that language intended to create pain, to hurt the other person? Or is the language that the other person is saying intended to hurt you, or to rile you up, or to ruffle your feathers, whatever you want to say? So again, language is very important. Recognizing it right away, putting a stop to it is very important, because again, the more you get used to recognizing the warning signs, the quicker you can stop it, the quicker you can go back to the relationship and say, hey, we need a break, a timeout, let's talk about it in 20 minutes or whatever it is, because then you're breaking that negative pattern and cycle of drama, and you will automatically look for other ways to meet your needs. And we'll talk about that too in a second. So 3, invalidating. That means that your partner's trying to make a point or trying to express himself, and the whole time you're thinking of how you're going to respond to invalidate their feeling. Well, I'm feeling sad. Well, what do you want me to do about it? You're making me feel blah, blah, blah. So instead of actually listening and saying, oh, I'm sorry you feel that way, even if you don't agree with the person, just the fact that you validate feelings. And one of the things that I've found working with couples of different backgrounds, different demographic, age groups, from many different places, is that validating is one of the biggest keys to communication. Because as soon as the other person feels heard, the other person is more willing to even forget about the problem as soon as they feel that their partner is actually understanding where they're coming from, whether they agree or not. So if you start seeing that people are invalidating each other, that's a big key, a warning sign that maybe there's time, to kind of step back and that you're going into that drama cycle. 4, negative interpretations. So anything that you say or I say is taken to a negative light. Even if you say something positive to kind of lighten it up, if the other person is already so defensive that they're already interpreting in a negative way. For example, a good example that I heard a couple say is that every time somebody else used to say, for example, what are we having for dinner? The other person would say, why do I have to think about dinner? Am I always the one that has to cook? When the other person might have been thinking in their mind, maybe we want to go out to dinner, or maybe we can do something together, or I can cook for you, So again, even lighter things start being negatively interpreted. So a lot of these warning signs, what tends to happen is that people let things simmer. So when the person comes home or you find yourself in another situation, all of a sudden these warning signs are coming up because you have something like a volcano that you haven't tapped into, you haven't touched, you haven't dealt with, that's ready to explode, and these warning signs come up, which is a good time for you to reflect and sit back and recognize if it's actually that the person says something about what are we having for dinner, or if there's something else that's truly creating that. So again, negative interpretations is very important. Bringing up the past, last year or 2 years ago, 10 years ago, last week, bringing up the past, again, non-functional, a big warning sign, always and never. These are words that you should take out of your vocabulary. And these are some of the things that actually I will be discussing probably in some of the other videos when we talk about communication, but I'm just planting this seed initially so I can start to simmer and can work more functionally when we get to that section. But words like always and never, got to get them out. Because do you always do something? Probably not. Do you never do something? Probably not. If the person says, well, you never say I love you. Well, they probably do once in a while, even if it's once a week or once a month. But as soon as you say always and never, the person's mind goes defensive mode. There's no communication at that point. So as soon as somebody starts using generalizing and saying always and never, recognize it. 7, and again, intentional pain. If you're automatically just trying to hurt the other person, that's something to be able to remember and look at. So all these are kind of warning signs, and one of the things that I want you to do is to take a look at your own warning signs, because we all have different ones. There's minor ones. Maybe you get a little bit of the shakes in your body language. Maybe you start feeling a little anxious, so your body starts getting shaky. Maybe you start getting that pit in your stomach, that feeling. For some people, it's actually headaches before there's even anything negative. But just looking at some of those warning signs and triggers, that way as you can catch them, because like anything else, for example, if somebody's addicted to a drug, one of the things that they have to do is to be able to understand their triggers and what are some of the warning signs before they have that addiction and want to meet that need. Whether, for example, a lot of times people are addicted to drugs, if they did a lot of drugs in their room, as soon as they get into their room, their body starts craving it. And in fact, they can take a lot more heroin in their room than if they broke into somebody's house and took heroin over there. They'd probably die with 3/4 of a dose, even half a dose. Because as soon as you step into that room, the body starts preparing. The same thing happens with our body language. As soon as we have something that's triggering us, or if there's tension in the air, our body picks up on it and prepares for that fight or flight. So recognizing those small things are one of the best things you could do. So what are some of the things that you can do at that point? And we'll talk more about it later on. But how can you meet that need? how can you do things as a couple that will meet that adrenaline rush? What about some of the new experiences that you can have in your relationship to bring that new feeling, that rush in that relationship, that aliveness in the relationship? What are some of the games that you can play together? What are some of the things that you can bring joy into the relationship? And again, those are things that we're going to talk about, because once you can replace it, you see, you can't just take something and not replace it with something else. Because if you try to do it, it's going to stay there. You have to take that, that pattern and get a functional pattern that you can put it there, and so your body and your mind knows what to do in that mind state. Kind of makes sense? So again, we're going to go over some of those things that you could do as we go on and we talk about joy and happiness. But until the meantime, reflect on some of those things, get to know yourself at that level, take the time, and I will guarantee you again that it's going to help improve once you understand what your warning signs are, once you understand your drama patterns, and you can replace them with something more functional.
Visit transformationacademy.com/toolbox to download free life coaching worksheets that go with the activities discussed in this podcast, plus other resources for creating a thriving life coaching business.